In January of 2016, a candidate for the presidency of the United States spoke at a small Christian college in Iowa. He warned about Muslims and immigrants. He called his opponents stupid and pathetic. He warned the audience that Christianity was under siege, and he boasted that he could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and he wouldn't lose any voters. The crowd applauded, and to the shock of many, evangelicals went on to vote for him in record numbers. This is the story of how evangelicalism became corrupted and fractured a nation.
Jesus and John Wayne. Jesus and John Wayne. They're both real men, they both like whips, they both have pistols on their hips. Well, at least one of them does. For manliness we take our tips from Jesus and John Wayne.
Hallelujah!
My name is Sky Jitani. I'm the co-host of the Holy Post podcast. In the last episode, history professor Kristen Kobes-Dumais took us through the rise of the religious right in the 1970s and 80s, and how the Cold War mindset of militant masculinity was adapted by evangelicals for the culture war between liberals and conservatives. This week, our conversation focuses on the 1990s and early 2000s. It was a time of promise keepers and servant leaders, of purity culture and megachurch pragmatism. Dumais explains why this era was so confusing for evangelicals, and how even positive trends, like a new focus on racial reconciliation, foreshadowed the deep divisions over race and justice we're seeing today. Our conversation is split into 4 parts, and timestamps for each one can be found in the show notes. Welcome to Episode 3 of Jesus and John Wayne. Okay, so we've talked quite a bit about how the Cold War shaped a lot of American evangelicalism in the 20th century. But then in the early 1990s, the Cold War ended with the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Eastern Bloc countries coming more into a line with the West and the EU. Describe how the early 90s began to change American evangelicalism, and particularly the masculinity movement, or the definition of masculinity in that era, and how it was trying to find its way.
Yeah, the 1990s are such an interesting decade for this larger story, and I think for younger listeners who are younger than the two of us are, it can be hard to kind of understand that transition, right? Because everything was kind of framed by Cold War categories up through the 1980s. All of our action movies and stuff. We always knew who the enemy was going to be. It was Russia. It was the communists, and we had the spy genre. I remember then. I think I was in grade school or just in high school, and wrote a big paper on the Berlin Wall. Will it fall or not? Kind of thing. That was just everything. And then all of a sudden, it was done. It was done. The wall came down, and the Cold War came to an end, and it was a disorienting time. It was great. It was like we won. It was totally not as bad as we thought it was going to be. After living with this apocalyptic scenario for so long. And so for all Americans, I think it was this time of, okay, where are we now? For evangelicals in particular, because so much of their value system had been forged in the Cold War reality. So things were up for grabs. And that's why the 1990s are so interesting. When it came to politics, there was a lot of questioning of, what do we do now? Maybe this whole, kind of culture wars politics isn't as necessary anymore. Let's look globally. And so you have a movement to address global poverty within evangelical circles. This is where we see the rise of anti-trafficking activism, attention to global persecution of Christians. And then in terms of masculinity, there were a lot of questions. What does it mean to be a Christian man? There was such a strong sense that times have changed, right? The economy had changed. This whole male breadwinner economy wasn't really happening anymore. Feminism kind of here to stay. And so what does it mean to be a Christian man? And there were a lot of answers. The one word that came up over and over and over again when I was reading what evangelicals were writing about during this time was confusion. things are so confusing. And so people stepped in to try to solve the problem, to put an end to the confusion, to give clear answers. And the most prominent place where those answers were provided was the Promise Keepers movement, right? Uh,
Yeah.
you
So
probably remember.
yes, I was in high school and college during the
Yeah.
1990s, and it was also the time when I was first really introduced to the evangelical subculture. And the two things that kind of dominated my imagination at the time, not because I wanted them to, but they were just always in my face, were Promise Keepers and the Purity movement.
Yes.
And the Purity movement was kind of in its incubation stages
Hmm.
at that time. It wasn't as
Hmm.
defined as it became in the 2000s, but it was certainly there. And both of those, in different ways, were vying for my conception of what it meant as an adolescent at the time, was vying for my understanding of what it meant for me to be a Christian young man at that time.
Yeah.
And so describe how Promise Keepers came about and how it was a little bit different from the vision of masculinity that you had talked about during the Cold War, kind of the John Wayne, hence your title, kind of masculinity.
Yeah, so Promise Keepers was the brainchild of Bill McCartney, right, football coach at the University of Colorado, and he actually was raised Catholic and then converted to evangelicalism, but went through a kind of crisis moment. So he was a very successful football coach, but started to question his role as a parent, as a dad. And one of the catalysts for this was the fact that his daughter, who was not married, got pregnant by one of his football players, and then had a child out of wedlock, and then again, and so he was questioning his own role as a father, and his broader role as a Christian man, despite all of his success. And so he starts to address this and have some kind of rallies in. Calling Christian men together to talk about this. It wasn't such a big deal until James Dobson got a hold of this and started promoting it. And Dobson is kind of everywhere beneath the surface in this book and really in the 1990s, kind of facilitating, platforming, amplifying these messages. And so Bill McCartney starts this movement to call men to be better Christians, be better fathers, be better husbands, to keep the promises that they've made. And his vision of masculinity isn't the old kind of militant authoritarian masculinity. And the Promise Keepers movement was really trying to chart a new way forward, not not embracing this, what they saw like this almost outdated machismo that just wasn't viable anymore. But they also weren't leaning all the way in to kind of egalitarianism for the most part. Although here too, it was confusing. Times were confusing, and the evangelical men's movement was confusing because it was a pretty large umbrella. And underneath that umbrella, you could find still some pretty clear patriarchal teachings, rather harsh in some cases. And you could find, like Gary Oliver was the clearest example of this, a pretty clear egalitarian framework. Um, but even there, the more patriarchal guys would kind of hedge their bets and say, pay lip service to, oh, but women are kind of equal before God. And the more egalitarian guys would also say, oh, but we don't mean like gender sameness, and we do not like feminists. So, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of contradictions. But the kind of favorite motif that emerges within the evangelical men's movement is to try to hold these in tension. And so we have the emergence of soft patriarchy. So you got to be a patriarch. You have to lead your family. That is absolutely key, but you should be really nice about it. You should be kind about it, because you're called to do this on behalf of women and children. The tender warrior is another
Yeah.
famous and favorite motif. So be a warrior, defend your family, fight those battles, but have a tender heart when you do it.
The
And then
image
servant leadership, right, is the third, right? So you've got soft patriarchy, tender warrior, and servant leadership, and they all kind of work in the same way.
So we'll unpack the servant leadership thing for sure in a second. But the memory I have of Promise Keepers, I never went to a Promise Keepers rally, but there seems like their material and advertising was ubiquitous.
Yeah.
It's of a middle-aged, balding, suburban white dad wearing gym shoes and khaki pants with a tucked-in polo, crying
Yes.
on his friend's shoulder.
Yes.
That's kind of the Promise Keeper image, and it's not the John Wayne hyper militant, punch him in the face
No.
kind of Christianity that maybe an earlier era had epitomized. What do you account? How do you explain this tender idea being introduced to the warrior, or the servant idea being introduced to leadership? Where did that softer side come from in the 1990s?
Yeah, and you're right. It was I actually have a picture of the book too that looks very much like that image, right? The tucked in polo shirts and the khakis and the emotion, right? They're singing praise songs and they're hugging and they're confessing and they're crying. Um, and part of this, I mean, it came from various places, but part of it came from kind of the mythopoetic men's movement. There's a secular version, right, to kind of discover a more spiritual side of masculinity, and this kind of understanding masculinity in terms of rites of passage, and fathers have to train their sons and guide them. But within evangelicalism, also just a real sense that times had changed, and that the older models of patriarchy just didn't fit anymore. It didn't fit the younger generation. It didn't fit this kind of masculine leadership. Just wasn't really true to people's experience. Women were in the workforce. The labor market for traditionally masculine work had changed. This is now we're well into the post-industrial economy. The working class wasn't really uh, uh, viable to make a living for many, kind of middle class Americans, and so there's a real sense of just so much had shifted, and we need to have a kind of an updated way to be a Christian man, and that emotion maybe wasn't such a bad thing, and we need to embrace that and find a way to do that while still being leaders.
I know you talked about this in the book and you mentioned just now the shift economically from industrial economy to a service
Hmm.
economy. But another component of it, and I don't know if you came across this in your research, and this is totally anecdotal on my part, so I could
Hmm.
be completely wrong. But it felt like to me the wealth that developed in the 1980s, right? The emergence of the Reagan Revolution and all the um, economic growth that occurred, the rise of the yuppies and that kind of environment led to the therapeutic culture of the 1980s and 90s, the self-help culture, all the gurus that came out of the woodwork with the books, and we were sort of ailing from the problems of becoming a wealthy nation, right? It was
Yeah.
no longer just defeating the communists or striving to get a good job. It was, we have money, we have suburbia, we have cars, we have teenagers that have more money than they know what to do with, and our family structure is suffering. And you see mega churches emerge at this time with a very therapeutic gospel and a self-help kind of model of ministry. And did Promise Keepers kind of just step into that flow of the larger self-help mantra of the era? I'm thinking of, even Saturday Night Live made fun of this with Stuart Smalley and I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and darn it, people like me kind of poking fun at how much that was part of the culture in that era.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And this self-help culture, it permeated American evangelicalism. As you say, it wasn't limited to American evangelicalism. We could talk about, kind of connections to prosperity teachings. The kind of self-proclaimed father of the Christian men's movement was Ed Lewis Cole, and his book "Maximized Manhood," published already in the '80s, kind of kicked this off, and he was a very popular speaker then at Promise Keepers rallies. And his was very much this idea of, the title "Maximized Manhood." What is the way to live this, fully blessed life? What does that look like? And for him, it was patriarchal, but it was not authoritarian. It was not old school macho macho. It was, again, trying to find this middle ground. And it was living your fullest self and experiencing that as a man. Right. And so what responsibilities went along with that. And you're right. It was a time of prosperity on the one hand, and you have this explosion of these suburban mega churches, and that's just the kind of ground zero for this evangelical men's movement. But then you also have men who are struggling then to come to terms with how their kind of office work, their not this kind of new way of earning a living, how that what kind of a masculinity they embrace when all they do is put on their khakis and polo shirts and drive into the air conditioned office every day. So it just felt like things were different. So what does it mean for them to be strong, courageous Christian men?
So, in that, you already talked about the emergence of servant leadership as an umbrella term under which a lot of this occurred. I, again, having just entered the evangelical subculture at this time, I assumed servant leadership was a term that had been around for a long, long time, that it long predated me, but it appears it didn't. Define servant leadership and why you don't think it's really that much of a departure from the bold patriarchy that existed in an earlier decade or so.
Yeah, servant leadership is actually really hard to define because it's one of those terms that can mean all sorts of different things depending on who's using it and how they're using it. And it had been, as a concept, it had been around longer. So it was in the business world. It also pops up in Alcoholics Anonymous and other circles, and it's being used in different ways. But it's really, I think, from the business world that it moves into the evangelical world. And there's this fascinating book by Bethany Martin that's called To Serve God and Walmart. And she talks about how this idea of servant leadership emerged in the 1970s within this kind of new corporate culture to kind of justify and bolster masculine identity, masculine ego, even as the vast majority of men who worked in corporations like Walmart were not leaders, right? They're mid-level management, they're workers, they're employees. There's no heroic warrior masculinity going on there, and yet they wanted to kind of bolster this identity of you can be servant leaders, right? So you're serving the corporation, you're part of this bigger thing, you're doing great work, and you're serving your families, and so you are still a leader in your family situation. You can be a leader in your church situation. And basically your masculinity is fully intact, even as you're serving corporate America. And so that's kind of one conception of it. And then it gets embraced in evangelical circles to do all kinds of different things, frankly. It can be used by pretty, kind of by people promoting pretty harsh patriarchal teachings, old school style, still quite authoritarian, but it provides this really soft veneer over it because sure, yes, you lead, and yes, you assert your authority, and yes, you discipline, but you know what? You're doing this all for the sake of your wife and children. You're doing this for the sake of the church. So it's all good, right? That's kind of it's one extreme. And then it can be applied in a much kind of with a lighter touch by men who were genuinely, seeking to do the absolute best for their families, to embrace it in a sacrificial way, to use it to really inspire or challenge themselves to put themselves second or last, and to put the interests of their family ahead of them. And so it really can be used across the whole spectrum. And that's why I think it's such a touchy concept. To be honest, I think there's a lot of provocative things in Jesus and John Wayne, but it's this discussion of servant leadership more than anything else, I think, that tends to provoke responses that are I would say angry, because it strikes people personally. People who have embraced servant leadership, people who feel like that it has done really good things for them, and I'm talking men here, not people. Um, and then to hear that there might be a critical edge to it, that it might not just be selfless, that it might not just be sacrificial, that it might be a more complex concept that, on the one hand, might allow men to do some really selfless things and inspire them to do so, but maybe they are doing things that are not entirely selfless, but can convince themselves and try to convince others that they are. So it's this fascinating concept that I think we have to be much more critical about and take a closer look at.
So, couple things here. Is it fair to say that servant leadership, the term servant leadership, functions something like a Rorschach test where we see in it whatever we want to see in it?
Whatever
Rather,
we want to see or whatever we experienced, and like our own positionality is going to come to play. So if you are okay, so here's some of the people who get upset with this treatment of a servant leadership have tended to be very powerful white evangelical men who continue to hold positions of enormous power. And they are the most defensive about the term because I think they have most fully embraced it to present what they are doing and understand how they wield their power in a very Christian, very selfless, very beautiful way,
so in
right?
other words, it's okay for me to have all of this power
Yes,
because I'm using it for the good of others,
exactly, exactly,
which
and
sounds pretty good to me.
so
But
it
so
sounds great,
what's the
yes.
downside of it?
So talk about positionality. I'll tell you that to me the word can sometimes be a bit triggering, to be honest, because I've also heard it wielded so often by people to justify, the power that they are wielding that is not being wielded on behalf of others. It really is not, right? And so it can cover a multitude of instances, and then to think about who is excluded, right? I mean, the whole Promise Keepers movement. I was in high school, college at the time too. I clearly was never invited. It was this very murky, as a woman, as a girl at the time, it was weird, honestly, because all the guys in the churches in my college, they would go up weekend. They're going with their dads to Promise Keepers. They're all getting on the bus, and and from the outside, I didn't care all that much. I wasn't really into gender studies at that point. But at the same time, it's like, what's really happening there? And and why am I not invited? Not that I wanted to spend my weekend on a bus going to a stadium with a bunch of dads from church, but it was kind of mysterious. And so I think the servant leadership concept as well. We should think about who is excluded from that, right? Who gets to wield that servant leadership, and who never gets to, who never has access to that power, and just be a little bit more critical in the ways in which in the ways in which it provides kind of cover for exclusion and for power.
So the other aspect of the term that intrigues me, and this isn't limited to servant leadership, is just the underlying assumption that leadership equals masculinity.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and that you see even when the servant portion is dropped. Just
Yeah.
leadership in general is associated with masculinity, period.
Yes.
Um, and it does feel like you add servant onto it to make it palatable,
Yeah.
to make
Yeah.
it acceptable. But I don't know. I mean, I guess in some places I have heard servant leadership applied to women, but it's not as commonly used
No,
that way.
not at all.
So
Not at
during the
all.
1990s, I'm not sure, I don't think you touched on this in the book. Was there some kind of women's ministry equivalent to Promise Keepers? I mean, there have always been women's ministries, but was there something that emerged in that era that was a counterbalance to Promise Keepers?
No, there were women's ministries. As you said, there have always been women's ministries, not in the same way, not calling women to leadership. Certainly not. What you did have is kind of these companion groups of women who would support their husbands as promise keepers, right? Who would confess their sins of usurping masculine power, who would confess their sins of smothering their sons or their husbands, and really try to divest themselves of any power so that they weren't taking that from the men in their lives and the power that they really needed. So there was more, if there was a companion movement, it was more of women trying to support men in the Promise Keepers and making sure that they were not leading, that they were not usurping this power that men felt, was ought to be theirs.
Okay, so one of the more intriguing parts of the Promise Keepers movement to me was how over the course of the 90s, increasingly it started talking about racial reconciliation.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that term came to the forefront in a lot of churches. Some prominent mega churches started really emphasizing it. And I mean, there was some joking I even recall in college where you go to Promise Keepers so you can say that you have a black friend and therefore
Yes.
you're not a racist because you hugged someone of color at
Yeah.
some point in
Yeah.
an emotional rally at Promise Keepers. Talk about the impact, both the sincere and perhaps insincere aspects of that within Promise Keepers and the effect it had on the movement, because that part was new to me
Yeah.
and really fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, Promise Keepers, it's confusing times, and you get these varying visions of masculinity, and they're competing, they're contradicting, and then you have the rise of racial reconciliation during this time, and it is genuine. Right. This is genuine. I want to I want to be clear about that. Among the leaders, among many participants, this move towards racial reconciliation, and Promise Keepers was one of the only white evangelical organizations in the country that made this a cause, right? So this wasn't like everybody's doing it, so we better do it
Right.
too. They were
Right.
leading in this. But what that looked like was very much see, I have a friend here who's not white, and we're hugging and we're crying together, and we're confessing our mutual sins, right? That's what they actually had, men, turn to each other, white, black, in the stadium, and confess your mutual racism. And so there was very little awareness of or interest in structural racism, in systemic racism. It was all individual kind of heart
But
feelings.
is that, I don't want to fault Promise Keepers for that because it feels like, and we've talked about this on the Holy Post regularly, like the popular evangelical conception of the gospel doesn't allow any space for a systemic understanding of sin in general, let alone social injustice and racism on a systemic level. It's so individualized. I can't
Well, it,
fault Promise Keepers for not having that broader vision.
Well, it is individualized on issues of race. It's a little less individualized on issues of, say, family values, right? Where
Fair
there's
enough.
a lot more of an emphasis on, oh no, we should have the government step in, and oh, we should use laws to enforce morality and things like that. So I do want to call that out, that it's very individualized on the issue of race. And but yes, there is that tradition. However, you do have voices. There's this really interesting, I talk in the book about a chapter in one of the Promise Keepers books by John Perkins, who when I read this, I thought, this can't be this, like a very clear call to his white brothers and to white Christians generally about racial inequality, with a sense of, systemic racism and kind of collective sins. And I just thought, yeah, and he does not mince words. And I thought, how is this a part of, because by and large, despite its emphasis on racial reconciliation, Promise Keepers, and despite their claiming that they weren't a political organization, they lined up fairly closely and with a lot of kind of revolving doors between the religious right, the politics of the religious right, right? Even
Right.
though they were not overtly a political organization, there was a lot of overlap there. But yes, on race, they made it very personal, very individual. That was an evangelical thing, but there were voices, particularly African American voices within the movement, who were calling them to something bigger. And critics throughout, particularly Black Christians, saying, this is falling short. You can do more. This is just window dressing. And so it really is kind of caught in the middle. On the one hand, it was not nothing. It absolutely was not nothing,
Mhm.
because we see the backlash that emerged within the Promise Keepers movement to this emphasis on racial reconciliation, a backlash that arguably, and in Bill McCartney's interpretation of what happened, led to the downfall of Promise Keepers movement broadly.
Yeah.
So it was real.
Okay, so that's the part I wanted to, that was new to me.
Yeah.
You cite a questionnaire from 1998 that showed 90% of Promise Keepers were still white men.
White. Hmm.
Um, and then McCartney himself conceded that the focus on race was, quote, a major factor in the significant fall off in attendance.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
on one level, I want to affirm Promise Keepers and McCartney for
Yes.
having the guts to do this, despite the
Exactly.
cost that they had to pay. And yet, the irony is, in many ways, it was window dressing.
Yeah.
And it didn't deal with the deeper systemic racial issues that a lot of people of color were calling them to. So they were punished for the window dressing even
Yes.
by itself,
Exactly.
which is stunning when you think about it.
Which makes a whole lot of sense of where we are now too,
Right.
right? Because and I know I think there's a tendency of people, you talked about servant leadership being a kind of Rorschach test, but Promise Keepers itself was this Rorschach test in the 1990s, right? Feminist national organization for women looking at it saying, "Oh, this is really bad. This is really, really bad. This is just the religious right in disguise, anti-feminist, anti-women." And you had evangelicals saying, no, this is progressive, this is all these things, and we have to allow for this complexity. These are not just good guys and bad guys on the issue of race. I think people will be tempted to say, oh, they're just a bunch of bigots, right, falling so short. It is just window dressing. They're just doing it to make themselves feel better about themselves so they can continue being white, racist patriarchs or whatever. um, or there's a tendency to make them heroes. And within evangelicalism, I think often Promise Keepers and just the evangelical emphasis on racial reconciliation in the 1990s is just celebrated. See, look at us, look at
Yeah.
what we've done. It's both, it's neither, right? And that's the complicated history that we have to sit with, and that is the complicated history that is continuing to shape our present moment. So it was not just, there was authentic love. There was authentic hope for racial progress. There was very little listening carefully and taking to heart the voices of non-white participants, the voices, those prophetic voices who were saying, yes, and this is not enough. Yes, and we need to take the next steps. And even that limited the limited steps in the direction of racial reconciliation was far too much for a pretty wide swath of white evangelical men, even men who were coming together to pray, to worship, right? There's another survey that I quote from a couple years earlier, I think it was 1996, that 40% of the complaints that came into the national organization that year were complaints about the emphasis on racial reconciliation. So that should tell us where evangelicals were these ordinary suburban white guys who wanted to serve God and serve their families, where they were on the issue of race.
Well, and all the more reason why they needed to address it, right? It's
Exactly.
that's the evidence that
Exactly.
this is a problem. Um, but the lesson learned there is one that I think is really important to emphasize, and it's one that we've seen repeated throughout the last 20 years, and that is when a large ministry decides to address the issue of race, or maybe I should specify, when a large predominantly white ministry decides to address the issue of race, they're generally punished
Yes.
by their constituents. They're punished
Yes.
financially. They're punished with loss of loyalty and engagement. And the message gets sent over and over and over again. If you go down this road, you're not going to have a sustainable ministry, so
Yes.
don't go there.
Yes.
And that's tragic in a certain way. We could spend all day on that, but I want to turn a corner to talk about how this emergence of the Promise Keepers and its vision of servant leadership and tender warrior, all that, parallels the emergence of the purity movement in the
Hmm.
1990s.
Hmm.
And in particular, how these two things came together in the Lewinsky scandal with Bill Clinton. Because in the late 90s, 1998, when that emerged, like I recall as a college student, or I just graduated from college, like evangelicals absolutely lost their minds
Yes.
because in Bill Clinton, they had their perfect enemy, their antagonist, right? This
Yeah.
draft dodging, hippie 1960s kid, liberal progressive who was not a promise keeper, right? He would broke his oath to his family and
Very
his wife,
much not.
whose wife was a feminist. And I mean, it's just like they're
Yes.
they're absolute perfect antithesis. But
Yeah.
how did the purity culture movement factor into this era of the 90s and the shaping of masculine masculine ideas in the church?
Yeah. So, I mean, the purity culture is purity teachings weren't new in the
Of
1990s,
course.
right? But the kind of purity culture, as they come together and as they really do move to the center of, and particularly for young Christians, right? You talk about that too, Promise Keepers and the purity movement. That's kind of, I mean, you go to a youth group in the 1990s, early 2000s. This is kind of the substance. This is the Christianity that you're going to be encountering. It's not to have sex before marriage, maybe not to even date. I Kiss Dating Goodbye goes on to sell more than 1 million copies. Like, this is what you do in evangelical youth groups. And you talk about not having sex and you make promises and pledges. And and it does dovetail with the Promise Keepers movement, right? This model of servant leadership on the part of men, of keeping your promises, on leading well, and of living morally, right? And so that's legit. That's an emphasis. Now, the purity movement, it's interesting because it was communicated in youth group to both men and women. And for women, what that really looked like was a huge emphasis on modesty.
Right.
Do not tempt the boys, because they are so easily tempted, and that's just the way they are. That's the way God made them, right? They're filled with testosterone, and so dress modestly. I mean, I remember these days too of only a one piece swimsuit only. I mean, my parents never would have let me buy a two piece anyway, but and maybe even wear a t-shirt over it if you're going to a summer camp. And lots of rules about clothing and how short shorts can be, and things like that. But the idea there was not to tempt the boys, because you are have these seductive capacities. For boys, it was more, yes, wait until marriage, but then you're going to be rewarded with mind-blowing sex, right? That's the idea. So you wait, don't wait too long, like get married soon. That's the goal here. Be very careful with dating, and that's where the courtship movement comes in. Like, dating, very, very, very dangerous because it can lead to sex. And so courtship, marriage, and then you can have sex as God intended within this patriarchal and heterosexual marriage. And then the sex is going to be really, really great because God made it that way.
Right. My friend Caitlin Beatty has coined the term the sexual prosperity gospel
Yeah.
to
Yeah,
describe, because it's the same theological framework, right?
exactly.
You obey and you're rewarded with what it is you want. But okay, inherent in that message, though, particularly about boys and men, seems to be a contradiction,
Yes.
because what we've been talking about now for a couple of hours is the evangelical conception of manhood as strength,
Yes.
power, militancy, protection, warrior, all this kind of stuff. And yet, the purity movement, the message is men are terribly fragile.
Yes.
We are so weak and
Yeah.
incapable of self-control that our ability to maintain our self-image as warrior protectors, he-men, all depends on a woman covering her neck and ankles. Like,
Yes.
so how do you reconcile those two messages of masculine strength and masculine weakness at the same time?
Yeah. Oh, it is. It's contradictory, and yet somehow it holds together. And I mean, we could look at Christian teachings on porn and see this contradiction, even more so, more extreme. That's something I didn't touch on much in this book, and could have. And Sam Perry has written a whole book on it. But yeah, the same thing of men are must be leaders, and they are called to be strong, but men are also really vulnerable too, right? And that's kind of why it takes so much work. Like, masculinity is no longer taken for granted. And I think that's kind of key here. And you can look at these economic shifts and cultural challenges and so on, but what you find is, like back in the 19th century, uh, there wasn't a lot of anxiety that men who are working on farms and working with their hands had of, am I really a man? Same thing, like working class men, like throughout the 20th century, same thing. Like, not a lot of like, oh, but am I really manly enough? But it's when that's called into question, that's when you start to hear the rhetoric of men have to be strong. Men are, this is their identity. They are warriors. They are, right. So there's definitely some compensation happening here.
Hmm.
It's a reflection of anxiety, and there's an awareness that not all men are strong, that, liberals and feminists have emasculated men and our country is in peril. And so it's up to Christians to, the more they talk about it, the more that reflects that this isn't a given, and masculine strength is not a given, that there are all sorts of, that they are being assaulted every day by attempts, whether it's the devil or secular humanists or feminists, to erode their God-given, strength, their God-given masculinity. And so somehow it holds together, but it also requires this, it plays into this us versus them mentality, right? There's an enemy out there. There's an enemy against us. And that enemy is, these external forces, but also women. Women are repeatedly seen as, not propping up their husbands' egos, seducing men who are not their husbands, that women are seen as a danger to men, as a danger to Christianity, to the church, to the nation. And so what the answer is containment, right? That women have to behave properly. They have to follow these rules, and men have to follow these rules. And again, none of this can be taken for granted, which is why we have to preach it over and over again, and why we have to teach it to our kids over and over again. And that's how it kind of moves to the center of Christianity and ends up kind of warping what Christianity actually is for a generation.
Okay, so I've never really understood that. I didn't grow up in that. I didn't experience that. I've never felt threatened in my masculinity, I guess. And it's not because I'm hyper masculine as the culture would define it or anything. I've
No.
never felt that way. I think part of it might be because I wasn't raised in an entirely evangelical home saturated with these kinds of ideas. Let's going out of the realm of history for a minute. I'm curious about your perspective here. Like, what you're raising kids, I'm raising kids, we have teenagers. Do you have boys and girls?
Yeah, my oldest 14-year-old is a boy, and then I've got two girls,
Okay, so
12 and 8.
we're both in the thick of this. I have a 16-year-old son, 19-year-old, and 13-year-old daughters. What do you think? I mean, we're getting outside of your area of expertise, perhaps, but as a parent, I consider you an expert. What do you think is the appropriate way we ought to perceive, acknowledge, identify, admit that there are differences
Mhm.
between boys and girls without fueling this ridiculous hyper masculinity, the stereotypes of femininity? What's the right way to navigate that without going to the extreme of saying there are no differences at all
Yeah.
and ignore all of that?
Yeah. Well, first, I will readily acknowledge that I have zero expertise as a parent. I'm totally making this up as I go along. But yeah, I think that just even the question of acknowledging differences. How do we nurture those differences? Yeah, many feminists, like there's almost no feminists who are going to say that there are no differences, right, between boys and girls, women and men. In fact, there's a strong strand of feminism that celebrates and absolutely cherishes gender difference. And so that's something that evangelicals might not be aware of, because evangelicals have depicted feminists as promoting gender sameness and
Right.
denying any difference, and that's just not historically true. um, but as a parent, I don't know. I just I have one boy and two girls, so not a huge sample set, and I really see them as individuals, right? As individuals first. And I'm kind of curious about. So my boy loves to fish, loves to fish, hates sports. So I could say, oh, boys will be boys. Look, there he goes out with his fishing pole again, and such a boy. But oh my gosh, put him on a football field, and it's scary. Like I tried soccer when he was little, and he was looking at the flowers the whole time and the bugs, and it was really a dangerous situation for him. So is his masculinity somehow not up to snuff, or why are we using those categories instead of thinking, if God knit each and every child together in the womb, and we put such an emphasis on that we're fearfully and wonderfully made, why the need to immediately put a box around masculine and feminine, instead of understanding that if each of us was designed individually with so many different gifts. And I've only begun to kind of comprehend the ways in which my children were made, and what that means, and what that will mean for their life. And I guess if you if gender difference is important to you, you can kind of just rest easy, right? The differences are there then, right? Whatever, but we have to discover what those are. And I think they're much more complicated than we might, or more varied than certainly than our boxes make them out to be. And that's cool, right? That you just nurture that child that God has given you in whatever direction their gifts are bringing them. But you also keep in mind. So here, I'm a Calvinist. That sin enters this picture a little bit too, right? So just because, I don't know, you happen to have an aggressive little boy, do you celebrate that? If he likes to, get into fist fights with the neighbor kids, is that something to be like, good on you, like that? And because that's what a lot of this conservative evangelical literature on masculinity says. Absolutely, you let your boys fight it out, and we need more of that. Or at some point, do you say, "Ooh, there's the fall," and maybe what does it look to work towards sanctification? What does it look to instill humility, to instill love or sacrifice, even in a young boy, right? These are the questions that I feel have really been excluded from a lot of the conversations that evangelicals have been having. So I'm all for asking these questions, but we need to ask them in much better ways and with much greater complexity, and honestly, just kind of relax a little bit about them.
Yeah, I affirm your parental instinct to just want to figure out your three kids and how
Yeah.
they're wired and parent them accordingly. I feel that all the time. I think the challenge becomes when we try to do things on a larger scale, when we try to
Hmm.
aggregate, for example, in a school or a church setting where you're trying to create something that serves a larger group. Is it okay to create something for boys, something for
Yeah.
girls? And the moment you do that, you're going to have to make assumptions
Hmm.
about how a group of kids operate, even if every individual doesn't necessarily plot exactly on the same
Yeah.
line. And that's where things get complicated. Is it okay to make certain assumptions about what it means to be a boy or a girl in those environments, even if
Yeah.
every individual may not track perfectly? It's messy. And yeah. Okay.
Yeah, well, let me just quick say
Yeah.
on that too, though, because I grew up in a church that was very much, boys do this, girls do crafts, girls learn to put on makeup, and girls, Calvinettes was my girls group, and boys do Pinewood Derby, and boys go out camping, and they learn how to
Right.
tie knots. Tying knots was a really big thing. Um, I don't know, I never learned to tie knots, so then, and now I'm in a church. It's a Christian Reformed church, and they have kids ministries, and they do it entirely differently.
Right.
So first they have the kids all together up until, I don't know, like second grade. And then they have like 4 years where it's girls club and boys club. But I was a girls club leader the last couple of years. And what that means is we actually teach our girls how to tie knots. We teach them we get to do the Pinewood Derby too. And there's so much like doing things together. And then sometimes we do things, or we might do them apart. And then in seventh grade, they come back together again, and it's the kids, or I don't know, youth group. And then it's all together. And there's just, it's possible to do these things in a very, very different way.
Right.
And it seems obvious, but honestly, it's been kind of shocking to me, right? Having grown up in one way, having seen, well, this is how you do kids ministries, and then being in a church that just doesn't. And you realize, oh my gosh, this makes so much more sense. There are other ways to do this.
Well, it also reveals how much of our assumptions about what boys and girls do is shaped by culture
Yes.
rather than biology or even theology. So, I mean, I know my daughters would probably love to go on a nature hike, and
Yeah.
my son would be totally into cooking, especially if it
Yes.
involved large quantities of sugar. So,
Yes.
it's there, there's a lot of stereotypes that go into this. At the same time, I don't want to completely ignore the fact that generally speaking, there are biological differences between men and women that
Mhm.
lead to propensities in different ways. I vividly recall when my son was probably before he could talk. He was a toddler and he crawled up into my daughter's room, and you hear him rummaging through the toy bin, and forever he's rummaging and rummaging, and finally he emerges and he's holding a little Matchbox car
Mhm.
that was somehow in there. It's like, okay, I didn't teach him that. There's something, and I'm not saying that all boys are like that, but
Exactly.
you have to, accommodate to the realities of each individual. All right, in the time we have left in this session, I want to talk about, we've talked a lot about the 1990s and
Yeah.
the interesting complexities that brought to this whole discussion. 9/11 happens, the terrorist
Yes.
attacks on September 11th, 2001. And that seems like a hinge point.
Hmm.
And a lot changed after 9/11, both
Yes.
politically, culturally, and certainly within the church and in our understanding of masculinity. Begin to take us through the changes and what 9/11 had to do with that.
Yeah. So first, I mean, the changes are the pendulum is swinging already in the late 90s, right? We already talked about the backlash against racial reconciliation. We also have a backlash against the emotive responses. Things were getting too soft. You had a lot of discomfort. You also had a backlash politically against this. I don't know what should Christians do in politics, right? And so you have Pat Buchanan and others and the religious right trying to no, the Cold War's done, but now we're in the midst of a culture war. Come on, guys, mobilize. We had the Clintons, the response to the Clinton White House, and so you have a lot of these kind of countervailing forces. And by the late 1990s, you do see the pendulum swinging back. You see within the evangelical men's movement a lot of calls for, oh, guys, things are getting too soft here. This is not good, right? We need to toughen men up again. And this fits neatly with the what's going on in national politics too, to kind of like reignite the culture wars. And so by the late 1990s, you have this is reflected in the literature that's being produced. Now, one other really important thing about Promise Keepers is by mobilizing hundreds of thousands of, really millions of evangelical men, it creates a market. Because even if men come home from Promise Keepers, their churches start men's groups. The SBC starts men's ministries, like denominations do. And so when men meet together, what are they going to do? Well, they'll go on their little weekend retreats, but they also need to read books. And so there's this huge market that is produced, and that stays with us even when Promise Keepers kind of wanes. But then the books that are appearing at the end of the 1990s, like written and coming out in 2000, 2001, they embrace once again this warrior masculinity, and they are explicit about you don't want tenderness in the trenches.
Yeah, this is
We
when Wild
need,
of Heart emerges.
yeah, Wild at Heart,
Which was
2001,
everywhere. I could
everywhere.
not avoid that stinking book.
It was everywhere. So we have John Eldridge's Wild at Heart. God is a warrior God, and every man is made in his image. Every man has a battle to fight and a beauty to rescue. James Dobson's Bringing Up Boys, all about testosterone, right? And talk about, you don't emasculate your little boys, 2001. Doug Wilson's Future Men, calling for a theology of fist fighting for your little boys, 2001. All of these are on the shelves in the first months of 2001. So the pendulum has swung back. What happens is 9/11 happens. Every man has a battle to fight. We have it, right? It's not metaphorical anymore.
Right.
It's very clear. And what you see happening is this Cold War framework of, us versus them. We need militant, strong men, protect Christian America. Had been set aside ever so briefly, and it's back, and it's very explicit. And evangelicals themselves are saying, we're taking the Cold War framework and we're applying it again. Except now the enemy, instead of communism, is radical Islam. And so with 9/11, that's really what amplifies these books, right? Contributes to their popularity. And so end up, Dobson sells more than 1 million copies. Wild at Heart sells more than 4 million copies in every evangelical church, it seems, every youth group, every college campus. Men are coming together and studying these books, studying them as God's word, God's direction for their life. And what you see happening then in the months and years after, because we're still essentially in that Wild at Heart era, it's ebbed and flowed a little bit. But you see this just widespread embrace of masculine militancy and of the strong warrior masculinity needed to lead your family, to lead your church, but especially to lead the nation.
You mentioned in the book how the 2000 presidential election, which is when George W. Bush was elected, he ran on a platform which he called compassionate
Yes.
conservatism.
Yes.
which is so 1990s kind of promise
So
keeper language. It's the tender
yes,
warrior. It's the
exactly.
servant leader, compassionate conservatism. And I remember that campaign vividly. And he did a pretty good job of selling that
He
message,
did.
right?
Yes.
Not enough to win the popular vote, but he still won the White House. And after 9/11, we that just got abandoned. That was
Yes.
completely thrown aside, and the movement became one of justifying preemptive invasion of Iraq and preemptive
Yes.
war, and we're going to, take it to these. But unlike the Cold War, which persisted for decades with this constant background threat of the Soviet Union and nuclear holocaust and all
Mhm.
that, 9/11, as traumatic as it was for the country and as long lasting as the effects were, it feels a little bit to me like we're back in a 1990s kind of moment where the the acute threat of Islamic terrorism isn't there. We haven't had another attack quite like 9/11 or even close to it. And we're kind of warring with each other again. It's more about
Yes.
culture war. I'm not hearing as much rhetoric about, oh my gosh, they're going to build a mosque at ground zero and Sharia law. I mean, it's there in some communities. Sharia law is going to take over the country. It's way more about um, Antifa, Black Lives Matter, the LGBT movement, these progressive liberals, and socialism masquerading in the Democratic Party. Like that's the big dangerous threat, which is an echo more of what I heard in the 1990s.
Yes. So when I say that we're still living in that kind of moment, it's in terms of the militancy. But you're right. The militancy and within the early 2000s evangelical movement, you have this virulent Islamophobia,
Right.
and that is produced, it is sustained, it is in very very explicit ways that I track in the book. But that goes hand in hand always with the culture wars, right? It's not one or the other. It's also very much, and we could take Mark Driscoll's Mars Hill Church as a great example of this too, right? The threat is in the Middle East. It's radical Islam, and it's the church down the street, even that doesn't have right doctrine. And it's it fits together so beautifully, right? You need to be a warrior. You need to, and you can. What does that look like? It looks like fighting, fighting terror. And it looks like what the Navy SEALs are doing, and the Airborne Rangers and the Green Berets and all of that. And it also looks like writing a check to I mean, they'll say this right, like write your check, warrior, to fund the organizations of the religious right who are fighting the culture wars, one and the same. So it's packaged together. So what happens is, even as the threat of Islam fades, but evangelicals do their very best to make sure that that threat is not fading, right? Continuing to kind of gin up that fear, definitely through the Obama administration, right? Barack Hussein Obama.
Mm-hmm.
um, Even as that fades, then the emphasis just very easily shifts to fighting the culture wars, defending against, I mean, you said it, Antifa, defending against those who are going to take away their religious liberty, defending against, defending our borders, defending, it's very pliable, this kind of warrior masculinity, because if every man needs a battle to fight, right, you can find the battles.
Yeah, I mean, this is the overarching theme of your book and what we've been talking about for a few hours now is can American evangelicalism exist without a war? Can
Right.
it exist without a fear and an enemy to define itself by? And
Yeah.
when we don't have that clear enemy, like in the 1990s and maybe a little bit today, we kind of just start shooting at anything and create the enemies in order to define ourselves, even if they're really not as big and obvious as, say, the Soviet Union. Um, okay, this is a big topic. We're probably not going to have time to get into it broadly, but just to preview what we'll talk about next time.
Mhm.
This is also the era in which we see the emergence of the young, restless, and reformed crowd. You
Yeah.
mentioned Mark Driscoll. You've identified yourself as reformed and Calvinist in your
Yes.
theology. Why why does the reform crowd become such an epicenter
Mhm.
for patriarchy and this masculinity movement in the 2000s? I always felt like I didn't have the secret handshake to be allowed
Yes.
in, And it felt very much like a fraternity. I went to a university that had a lot of fraternities, and I wasn't a part of one. And I always, you feel like an outsider a little bit. And in this era, in the 2000s, I started getting connected to Christianity Today and doing work for them and reporting. I was going around the country, and I was meeting to talk fashion again. I was meeting all these young guys with torn jeans and plaid shirts with pearl snap buttons on them, who were all part of this Young, Restless, and Reformed thing. And they tolerated me because I was from CT, but they didn't really let me in because I wasn't reformed enough.
Yeah. Did you
What?
drink beer with them?
No, I don't drink beer. I don't.
Yeah, that's another
I
problem.
only drink wine and whiskey. But
Yeah, yeah.
I drink other things other than wine and whiskey. But when it comes to alcoholic beverages, it's wine and whiskey. I wasn't one of them. But a core part of their identity was clear gender roles, a complementarian patriarchal view of things. Why did that particular theological movement become sort of the epicenter for this masculinity movement?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so first I have to quick jump back because you asked a super, super interesting question and then didn't let me answer it. And that was, can evangelicalism exist without an enemy?
Oh, right.
And honestly, I was thinking, can it? Evangelicals absolutely can and do, right? And so I just want to draw that distinction. Individual evangelicals, evangelical, communities, church. Yes, absolutely, we know them. They exist. There's a long tradition here, but your question was a little different. Can evangelicalism, right, as a movement, can it hold together without this defining enemy? And that's another question, because otherwise, evangelicals, if you don't have that, if you aren't drawing lines, drawing boundaries, then what does keep you from blurring with other Christians, with blurring across racial divides, right? A national divide. So I think that's an open question. I'll just leave that an open question, but a very interesting question. So evangelicalism versus evangelicals. But okay, the Young, Restless, and Reformed. Very confusing to me as well. Again, we're kind of contemporaries, and so we're coming of age and into the same movement. And I grew up very, very Calvinist. I went to Dort, then college, now university. I had an entire course on Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. For me, it was a Dutch Calvinism. So my dad wrote his dissertation on Abraham Kuyper, right? So I'm pretty reformed.
It sounds like you've got the pedigree for sure.
I do. Never celebrated Halloween, only ever Reformation Day. Right. Okay. So I'm reformed. And then I go out into the world and I start hearing about these guys, the Young, Restless, Reformed, neo-Calvinists. And I think, yes, this is our moment to shine, right? Because I firmly believed that, Reformed Christianity was the best Christianity, had the best answers. It really was true Christianity and has the most robust intellectual tradition, which is the truest Christianity, right? I mean, this is really what I was coming from. Confessions here, but then, like, so many American Christians weren't really, they weren't reformed. They were, I don't know what they were off doing, these evangelicals, and then so I thought, this is our moment in the sun, and this is awesome. And it didn't take me too long to realize that I was not part of this us, right? That I was not included, that my reformed pedigree counted for nothing if I didn't embrace complementarianism, if I didn't submit to their understanding of orthodox gender roles. And I was not a raving feminist at the time, not at all, but I was single and in graduate school. And, there was just no place for me in that tradition. So it was a personal kind of struggle to understand, who are these people. I think it ended up becoming really popular in some ways because, they pitted Reformed theology, or their particular understanding of Reformed theology, over against what they saw to be kind of the fluffiness of evangelicalism. It was seen as a reaction against this overemphasis on emotion, this lack of of solid doctrine. In some ways, it was pitted as, against this consumer a culture of evangelicalism, where people would sing the praise songs but not really have that theological substance. So it was kind of sold as an antidote to this consumerized evangelicalism, even as it was its own kind of next iteration of, here's a brand, right? That you knew, that you didn't know the
Right.
secret handshake. So it was its own iteration, but it was packaged and sold as this is better. It's more masculine. It's more rigorous. It's more theological, and it's more true.
Yeah, maybe antidote to the consumer evangelicalism is correct, but also an antidote to the therapeutic
Oh, yes. Consumer
evangelicalism, right?
therapeutic, all
Right,
of the
yeah,
above.
all that kind of.
Absolutely.
So, but the fact that again that gets associated with femininity
Yes.
and the rigorous intellectual capacity of Reformed theology is just assumed to be masculine.
Absolutely. And you can see where, for somebody like me who was a woman, who was reformed, who was studying religious and intellectual history at one of the top universities in the country, it counted for nothing because I was a woman, right? These boundaries are not always visible to people inside the movement. Had I been a man, had I been male, I probably would have found a somewhat welcome home there, right? And so I wouldn't have been aware that those boundaries existed. It just would have been theologically rigorous and pure reformed and all these good things. But if you are a woman, or I will say, if you are not white in many of these circles, right, those boundaries are very visible to you. And so this is where we have to talk across difference, because to those at the center of the movement, they can say, no, this is just truth. This is just, this is just correct. This is just, there are no boundaries here, because they aren't personally bumping up against those boundaries.
Well, we're about out of time. We're going to resume this. We're going to pick up this topic the next time we talk, though, because I want to discuss more about those gender boundaries, the racial boundaries. A lot's been coming out lately about African Americans who are involved in that movement and their struggle to
Yes.
get folks to recognize the reality of systemic injustice. And so I think there's a lot to unpack there, and then ultimately lead us up to where we are now in 2021 and how we got to the Trump era and what's coming after it. But Kristen Dumais, thank you so much for your perspective, your wisdom, your research and study. It's invaluable in giving us perspective on who we are and where we are.
All right. Thank you. Can't wait to talk again.
The Jesus and John Wayne podcast miniseries is a production of The Holy Post. It's based on the book Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes-Dumais and features Dr. Dumais and me, Skye Jitani. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This series has been made possible by the generous support of Holy Post listeners like you. And if you'd like to find more smart Christian content like this, go to holypost.com for more podcasts, videos, and news stories. Be sure to rate and like us wherever you get your podcasts so others can discover intelligent Christian commentary from people who take Jesus seriously, but not themselves.